I suspect that I was invited to this session for my sins. Because after such a delightful novel that Joanne has written, who am I now to come and add more to it and to give more illumination than she has done? But I think before I hand over and ask a few questions, let me just make a few observations. One, that once you begin to work on a novel, there's often a certain obsession, certain anxieties that shake a writer, a dramatist, an observer of life to want to say something or several things about the subject matter that comes, and different subject matters for that matter, through the novel that he or she writes, or a work of art across the board for that matter. So a writer who has to spend 9 years on a novel like she did must be obsessed with something that is very strong. Ambition is of sterner stuff, as Shakespeare reminds us. So Joanne belongs to that breed of amazing individuals, amazing creatives. So that observation for me brings a certain degree of humility, because she has invested so much in the work that we're celebrating this evening. Secondly, there's a certain degree of commitment to craft that is so vivid in the imagination that comes through this novel. She writes across several decades, and she brings to the fore several strong voices. And for me, what is even strong is that the feminist voice is overwhelmingly strong, poignant. How can you forget a young girl who says to her mother, "It's time I take over your chores because you're not well," and not leaving it there, going further to say to the father convincingly, firmly, that "Papa, give mother a chance, I'll take over." What a strong feminist liberatory statement that this young girl makes with so much fortitude in a world that oppresses, that meets so much violence against women, particularly young girls. So this is a form of introduction. But the third one, which is the last one, is that in a story that cuts across decades, that is almost epic. You imagine the journey of young indentured laborers. In the case of the protagonist, she comes to South Africa seeing indentured labor as a form of escape, hoping this is still better than a very oppressive, caste-based life in India. So let me come over and hopefully my fortunes could turn out for the better. So the choices that an author has to make, if the story is so expansive, there's such a wide range of choices, but also the possibilities of getting wild are immense, and the discipline that comes with craftsmanship. I wish there was another word than craftsmanship, but you get the point I'm trying to make. Yeah. So the discipline that she shows, that Joanne shows, is remarkable. And let's give her a warm round of applause again. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. So let us go back to this theme of the world, the storied world of your childhood. How do you think this storied world of your childhood had a major bearing on the journey that you embarked upon when you said, "I want to write this kind of historical novel that brings back," because the issue of indenture in South Africa, I don't think we're talking about it enough. In fact, some people don't even know about it. I mean, I don't even think some people, a lot. We just say, oh, here are Indians. They're in Durban, most of them. Oh, they've got businesses. Oh, they've got, whatever stereotypes you have. But the brutality that was at the heart of the foundations of the economy in Port Natal, and modern day KwaZulu-Natal, have a lot to do with indentured labor from India. So just give us, what were some of the obsessions that you think at the end said to you, I must tell this story?
Brasandile, thank you so much for that intro. I mean, and you've got that kind of voice that kind of lulls you. I find myself just getting comfortable here and wanting to continue listening to you and not answer any of the questions you're asking. But thank you for this evening, you and Vashna, and thank you so much, Mwelela, you and Richard and the team for inviting me here. So lovely to be here in this beautiful, cozy space, that is doing so much in a revolutionary way. I love the idea of it, and I love the work you're doing here. But thank you, Brasandile, for that beautiful review that you wrote of it, because you touched so deeply on the issues that inform this book. And that is one reason I was very excited to hear that you and Vashna were going to be my discussants this evening, because it's two people who've grappled with the text greatly. So what is it that took me 9 years? I wish I could say to you, I was crafting this novel in some dramatic way, and grappling with the kind of things that really experienced writers do. By contrast, I was struggling to write it. Right? To be quite honest. I had studied literature for a long time. I'd studied African literature, European literature, and so forth. Done English, drama, and film at university. I'd written a lot of news and current affairs and documentary-related work, but I had not sat with a historical novel. The genre itself is just so demanding. And I had no idea how to go about it. And so I started with various versions of it. What you have read is the 22nd iteration of it. And it really represents the kind of struggle that I had to get it right, because I simply did not know how to write in the genre at the time. And it took me a very long time and a lot of reading of existing works in the genre. And crafting of the novel slowly, bit by bit, intermittently, balancing it with my media job, in order to get to the point where I felt, well, this is a draft I could actually show someone. And eventually I did show it to Helen Moffat, who was my editor on the book, and she gave me that last little impetus to spend the last, say, 3 years or so doing the real work of I would say, yes, crafting it, sculpting it in a way that I hadn't managed to before. So the last 3 years were probably the most productive in terms of what I was able to achieve.
And in all of this, Joanne, where are you? Because as you sort of bring these voices of a brutal, violent colonial past, you bring them to life. It's like, you're a tomb raider of sorts, but for a very good reason, a noble reason. And you want to tell these stories. So where are you? Because there's a sense in which writing begins from a certain perspective. There's a sense of self. But as you get to immerse yourself in the work, something in you as well emerges. And sometimes it frightens you, but I would imagine it makes you feel, I'm on the right path. So in your case, what was that experience? How was it like?
So for me, it was the story of my great-grandmother, Adilakshmi Velunaikan, who came to the country in the early 19th century. It was the late 1700s or so when she came to South Africa. And, there was a lot of secrecy in our family about the circumstances of her having come here, her life here, and so forth. And I kept asking my mother these questions. And you're right, it's very personal. It was shortly after the birth of my daughter that I started thinking more seriously about lineage. And I asked my mother several questions. I have a fairly good idea of my father's history. On my father's side, there are passenger Indians, and so their history is much better documented. Not so on my mother's side. And I didn't know whether it was shame, whether it was trauma, a combination of both that prevented them from speaking about it. But the oral history has been severely eroded over the centuries. And so I set out to try to find out what the story of my great-grandmother was, why she would have left India at that time, the sort of influences that would have encouraged her to get on a ship and come to South Africa with her siblings as a 21-year-old, no chaperones. They were all younger siblings. And how and why she decided to stay in Africa. What was it that drew her here, and what was it that kept her here till her death? Several decades later. And I also looked at a little bit of her evolution that I was able to track in the archives. You know, she comes to South Africa as a young woman. Her brother is sent back a year later after they've worked on the government railways for 1 year. He's sent back as an invalid on a ship. But she survives, she thrives, she gets married. She marries across the colour line as well. Interestingly, she marries a British man. And they have children, and she educates her children. You know, so it's very interesting. She runs a Methodist mission from her home for 30 years, even though she came to the country as a Hindu woman. And, you know, it was all of those areas of interest that I thought, yeah, there's something that has traveled through generations to me. What is it?
Well, there's something very special, and then I'm going to bring you into the discussion, Vashna. The way you are consistent about the value of education, even from your protagonist, this old woman who embraces her when she's young and prepares her for the future. She sees that this girl, there's fire, and this fire I must nurture for the future. And now you're talking about this in your own family as well. But also the role of missionaries. I mean, the missionaries in Africa, I mean, in all colonial territories, have got an ambivalent, sometimes controversial, but when it comes to education, I mean, I'm also a child of missionary education. It doesn't show, I know. But, you know, because you know what happens after that, yeah. But you lose your innocence, yeah. So it's long lost, yeah. But on a very serious note, the way, for instance, Father John protects and speaks on behalf of I'm forgetting now the character who's facing trial.
Yes, Shanti.
Yeah. Shanti, actually, yeah. And then basically says the education that I've shared with them, one, these are not savages. Two, I don't care whether they adopt Christianity. There is this power about education. There's something so special about education that it doesn't matter what kind of religion or whatever you have, give people education. This is such a strong message that your novel also sends across. Maybe let me also bring you in. Vashna.
Yeah, I mean, particularly on the theme around education, I think that the way in which, I mean, firstly, the way in which Joanne has written the novel is, for me as a historian, in itself an educational experience, because it allows you to, it brings alive the archive in a way that a historian just writing a general history never could, no matter how beautiful we make it sound, whether we're Walter Rodney or E.P. Thompson. It really brings nuance to this. And you also understand the power dynamics, and this is where education becomes so important, because it is a power dynamic, it's a power tool. What type of education?
What type of education?
That's really important, because I mean, is Father John Brown, what is Brown John? Is he going to think that Chinama, the woman, has the same amount of education or level, who has not been exposed maybe to Christian doctrine or what he considers to be education? So I think the way in which those nuances play out is so important. And as the story develops, you notice that even when Shanti was getting educated as a young girl, she feels the specialness of it. Because it is learning to read, learning to write. You feel like you're gaining some power in it. And that becomes so important. And you think about how that's denied people and women constantly in society, and you realize why? Because it gives you the sense of your power. And this is what the book illuminates so well. So for me, I think the question of education is really important. The question of how this book itself and the role of things like historical fiction, when done well.
When done well.
Yeah, not the sort of, I don't know, Queen Elizabeth, the first 100th novel about her love life or something. And when it's done well, then it's a really exceptional tool to teach and illuminate the experiences. I'm sure this, more than most of the stuff that my historian colleagues and I have written, would do more in terms of spreading and educating people about the role of indenture and what the lives of indentured people were, both here and in India. But also the way in which colonialism and mission education go hand in hand.
Right.
I mean, that's so important. That theme is also here. It's not overtly here. You're not like hitting us over the head, but subtly it's drawn out constantly, the threads of that type of education. And also the ways in which the masters of the plantation can go to church and they can do all their Christian duty, but then enact all of these horrors onto people, because mission education is tied so deeply to Christianity then. So that the differences in that religion and working that out. I think quickly want to point to the way in which Joanne very beautifully has the love story of Shanti and Mustafa across two religious groups.
Right.
Again. So the theme of religion as well is just drawn out throughout the book, which in today's world, having a Hindu woman and a Muslim man fall in love is quite a contentious thing. So that's so beautifully done as well, and it's such an enduring theme too.
I love that you touch on history, and you're a historian. In fact, I put a proposal that I want to do her work, because after I read it once, I was just shaken, and I realized that a review in a newspaper is just a start. I need to engage with the different nuances of the work, because good literature is a work of constant discovery. You are constantly finding light as you walk through the work. It takes you out of darkness in so many ways, metaphoric and otherwise. So the phrase I want to go to is a phrase drawn from the work of the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott, who says the sea is history. And of course, the British and their yearning for tea and other things was one of the key drivers of the sugar plantation and the brutality of that era, in the Caribbean, in India, here, and so many other territories. The sea is history. I come from Umzindo, that's my area, and at the beginning of the sugar plantation in KZN is one of the, it's one of the key centers of that industry. And my point is, just go back to the historical commitment to this work. What drives this? There's the biographical, of course, but also there's a sense of saying there are gaps in the historiography of this country. And also what you do here, you give us a text that doesn't just talk about that in South Africa. It includes Britain, it includes India, or the continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa. And that commitment to history, just give us a more perspective, your perspective on this.
Brasandile, you've made me think about so many things that formed part of the process of this, but I'm very fortunate. I'm studying towards a PhD at Wits at the moment in African literature, right? Don't sound so impressed. It's not going anywhere at the moment.
I know the trauma of that.
Exactly. I need therapy. But in truth, my supervisor, Isabel Hofmeyer, Professor Isabel Hofmeyer, has been writing about hydrocolonialism, right? And it just made me think so much about where do I start the novel, right? I could have started it on the plantations of Natal, and that would have worked as well. But as my brilliant publisher, Nkanyezi Chabalala, reminded me...
On saying that, yeah.
Yes, no, she's fantastic. Yeah. She's unbelievable, as was my brilliant history editor, Vashna. Yes, the idea of starting on a plantation does not give you a chance to explore the history of who people were before they became instruments of capitalism or racism or oppression or misogyny, for that matter. And that is why that story is so important to tell. It's interesting, there were a couple of publishers looking at the book, and there was another publisher that wanted to start at the point on the plantation. And I said, no. And that was my largest, my most important motivator in terms of determining who was going to publish the book. The team at Jonathan Ball understood where the story needed to start. The kernel of the story needed to start at a point where we saw human beings living their daily lives in their cultural, socio-religious, economic context, even in that British context of colonization, which was somewhat different in ways to the colonization in Africa. And once they got a grip of who these human beings were, they could then watch them, observe them travel across the colonized seas to another colonized land. And we don't often think about the seas being colonized. But actually, I mean, that was where it came from. Imagine the Indians of the time, the Africans of the time, everyone who was colonized, looking up one day, and the thing that is about to shake their peoples for centuries comes from the sea.
We are children of sugarcane, all of us.
We are indeed. So it was important for me to start at that point to bridge it with what happens on the ocean, because the ocean is an important cultural, religious space, aside from being a politicized space in which colonization takes place. A lot happens on the ship that changes the people who are traveling on that ship, not least who are leaving behind caste, for example. All of the culture that they have lived in begins to unravel on that ship. The dangers that are foretold as to what is going to happen on the plantations and other such spaces begin on the ship. So the sea becomes an important bridging space for what Shanti, my protagonist, has known in the past and what she is about to become deeply familiar with on the plantation.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the sea remains a site of immense struggle. Thank you very much for that. Vash, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that often as historians we are limited in the way in which we can tell stories, because we have to rely so heavily on the archive as the source. And if we wanted to include, I was so impressed that Joanne had done that, because to include this transoceanic story requires so much more work, so much more resources than we generally have as historians working in the global south. Yeah. It's not resources that we have access to. I mean, the other great novel done, the trilogy by Amitav Ghosh, The Sea of Poppies, which does something very similar looking at the ocean. So that was something that gave us, often, as a person reading it and knowing the history, it gives you an insight into how people's lives would have been, which we aren't allowed to imagine so much more. So that was really useful. But the ocean as a site of exploitation, of the birth of capitalism. We often see the birth of capitalism on the factory floor. And now I think that's one of the problems or the limitations of many of us who are Marxist scholars, is that we aren't able now to shift and see, well, actually, the site of exploitation of capital is everywhere, and it's all present. And actually, the site of it was not just the factory floor. To make the factory floor possible, you needed slavery, you needed indenture, you needed the sugar cane that used to go into the tea that fed the British factory workers to allow them to work ridiculous hours every day. So it's so important, that story. And I often think about how when the conquistadors arrived in Latin America and in Central America, when they saw them arriving, they thought it was some sort of witchcraft or some wizardry, some sort of magical thing that was coming over the seas. And it would feel like that, given this strange experience, and then the complete unraveling of society around that. But I think also what's really important is, when Joanne talks about the ocean as the space of where things begin to unravel, where the colonial world gets made and unmade, the old world gets unmade, the colonial world, the new world starts to get made, is so important, because it's a story of how colonialism actually is. It's not a simple thing. It's not just top-down oppression, bottom-up, like top-down oppression, bottom-up suffering. There's agency. People are getting married on the ships. People are losing their children on the ships. Women are separating and telling this man that they left, you are no longer my husband, I'm choosing this person. So there's all of that stuff happening. And at the same time, people who are often even running those ships are Indians. Are merchant Indians who are running the ships. There are merchant Indians who are bringing the food on those ships to come and feed indentured Indians here. I mean, like Joanne, I'm so surprised she said this, half my family are passenger Indians and my dad's half are indentured Indians. Wow. The difference in class, the difference in what education, in what historical narratives are kept is amazing. But those people were also profiteering of this colonial project. So it's not just a simple thing. And Joanne captures that so well. And I think even through the love stories with Raksha and David, immediately you begin to see in the first opening pages, this is not a simple narrative of oppressive colonialism. There's nuance, there's understanding that people fall in love across color line, across colonizers, and so on.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Well said. I know there's an eager audience that has got questions to, and so forth. I really love this. I like the way you're suggesting that we need to relook at the archive, but also not just relook at it, but the eyes that we use to look at the archive. What eyes are those? Is it just class, the so-called classical Marxist analysis, primitive accumulation, all those things, race, and now race and class and so on. And what she does here is that she shows us that, European modernity, European North American modernity was a consistently brutal, force. And that brutality is lived through so many generations of indentured laborers. But I move from there. You emphasize love. Vashna just spoke about it. That is very charming. Some of us maybe were too angry, but you found love. And even as you speak about this, I'm sounding like I'm more angry than you are. How do you blend this into the narrative? But because I would imagine it also influences the cadence, the voice, that drives the story. And I would imagine these are things you thought about. They are not just, something that you do in a flimsy way. It's deep in the craftsmanship, in the art. Yeah, art is better than in the art, yes, yeah.
So Brasandile, I'm really interested in how, during times of deep oppression or conflict, but let's say subjugation of whatever kind, how the oppressed find the means of maintaining their humanity. It's always amazing. You look at it. Jacob Tlamini writes about it quite frequently, and that's something I've enjoyed most about his books. Toni Morrison, exactly. How do people find love? We think about slavery, we think about apartheid, we think about some of the most horrific events in history, the Holocaust, things that have shaken human beings. What's happening in Palestine right now? Okay. How do people find the means to still find their joy during that time of oppression? They do somehow. They do. They find it in family. They find it in falling in love. They find it in staying in love. They might find it in some of the most superficial things, like going into a space where they can listen to music and dance, as happened in jazz clubs, right? But it is also a way that they assert their right to be happy and to be human. And it is a way in which they subvert the desire of their oppressors to stamp out that last little smidgen of happiness in their lives.
One love. Anyway, anybody from our beautiful audience with questions? Fire next time. My brother, I don't know, how do you do this thing?
I don't have a project manager.
There we go.
Thank you.
Sorted.
Thank you, my brother. Go ahead, yeah.
No, I just wanted to ask a question in terms of archiving. So the book is out, it's here, people can be able to read. But then, what other ways of people receiving planning to kind of go in that route? Maybe there's going to be an audio book where people just listen. Maybe there's going to be like a documentary that speaks about the book where people can just watch. So, because in terms of the audience, because there are people that not all everybody read books, then what
Point taken. Thank you.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a very good question. But at this stage, we don't have any plans to turn it into an audio book. We're hoping that if the book is going to be launched in May in lots of different countries, the UK, the US, most of the Commonwealth.
Congratulations. Wow, congratulations.
India.
Beautiful, man. Wow.
Thank you, Brasandi. And so we're hoping that if there is a great demand for the book in those territories, it will become a book that's made by Audible. In terms of documentaries, I am speaking to certain people about it because there's interest from an international broadcaster in a documentary type thing. So,
this is lovely.
I hope that these things will develop into bigger projects. You can never say at the infant stages. Maybe nothing will come of them, but I hope that it has at least the book has opened the discussion about indenture.
Yeah. Your book also makes me think about a question: Can the sugarcane speak? Can the sugarcane speak, Vash?
Yes, they speak all the time. We just don't listen. It's like even when Spivak said, can the subalterns speak? I think subalterns speak all the time. We just don't listen to them speaking. If you took the history of KwaZulu-Natal, the way in which the landscape has remained unchanged for 100 years. From KZN, you drive along the sugarcane plantations. You now admire them, the beautiful rolling green hills, completely erasing that history of how it's got there, the way in which the Zulu kingdom was completely smashed, the ways in which indentured laborers were brought there, the way in which the land was tamed into the harness and into working for capital is completely erased. And it's erased from our history, and it's erased from our vision when we're driving through. And now what's beginning to happen to erase that history even further is those sugarcane plantations are being turned into colonial plantation estates, run by Hewletts and so on, and they are still benefiting. The same people who profiteered the sugar barons are still benefiting from it, and they're using the aesthetic of the plantation to benefit off that, and that further erases that history of what it's built on. So I think it's
so the sugarcane can speak. Any further questions from anybody here? Have you read the book? Or you're about to buy it here? Well done.
Some people got a head start.
Yeah. Okay, how are we doing on time, my brother?
Yes, we're still in the box.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. Okay. So, okay. Yeah.
So Brasandile, on a couple of points that you and Vashna have made before, the issue of education. So, Dilip Menon, the professor of history, reminded me.
I know. I used to work with him at the HSRC. Yeah, I know him. Yeah, Dilip. Yeah.
Yeah. So very well. We had a chat at WITS the other day, and he spoke about how writing the past is always writing the present in some way.
Fantastic.
Right? And it's so true, because when you write about people 160 years ago who lived in abject poverty and experienced this level of oppression. You cannot stop thinking about the people in your country who are still living that way 160 years later. And it came through in an interview I was doing with an economist, that education was the one thing that changed the fate of so many African families in the country. But if children did not have access to a full and proper education, by that I mean the kind of holistic education we hope to give children in this country, that will uplift them and their families out of poverty. People remain poor for 9 generations. 9 generations. When I think about that, I find it staggering every time we talk about it. But 1 generation educated breaks the 9 generations of poverty. And that is what is so powerful about education. I keep going back to that in my mind and thinking this is why education is so important to our country, to our kids right now. And Vash also spoke about history and the way it is made available to us in textbooks and so forth. So I did an address for a group of teachers a couple of weeks ago on historical fiction and the use of it in the classroom, and it caused me to get into notions of how we teach history, right, in the classroom. And I'm so glad our government is looking at the history syllabus critically and saying, let's give this another shot, because we haven't covered what we need to, and our kids just don't know what they ought to know about the country, the continent, our relations with the rest of the world. But it took me back to something that Fred Gumalo also said about history, and he said, there is no reason that a historical novel cannot in principle be more educational than a textbook, right?
Definitely.
So long as the writer has covered their bases of doing the research, ensuring that the book is sound from that historical point
I love
of
it.
view.
I second it 100%. Let me just come in there. There's a famous quote, or it's not famous, but it's a quote I love. So, things that you like, you think they're famous. It's by Louis Ngozi, who was also a child of Sugarcane. He's from Durban. He says, one of the reasons novelists write about history is that they love the lies they tell. But historians, like narrow historians, are terrified, are ashamed rather. They're ashamed of the lies they tell, because if now we are this classical, narrow historian, somebody says, no man, but your facts were wrong. The novelist goes out to reimagine the world. So the historical novelist, of course, you don't lie on the facts even if you're doing the historical novel. But you've got a more leeway to be engaging with the subject matter. So that, for instance, if you read Nuruddin Farah maps, look at what maps have done to Africa, but not just Africa, to all territories that are colonized or conquered. Once you do because what would happen is that they conquer, and then they count people. How many of them? If there are so much, how much is the land worth? What is it worth? And how much can we pay back to the empire? So mapping and yeah. But anyway, you wanted to say something, Vashna.
Yeah, actually, what you're speaking on, Edward Said also talks about that.
Good. Yeah.
He says there's a part of the colonial project and the imperial project is the archiving and the mapping of the colonial subject. They come to you, they study you. There's the Egyptology departments at Oxford. There's SOAS. There's SOAS in London. He's like, there isn't the counter. In South Africa, there isn't the School of England. The School of Wales studies, there's none of the counter, and that goes back to the question of education and knowledge and power, because in knowledge and education there's power, and they have mapped you, they have marked you, they have archived you. That is why the archive is so important to the colonial project. Luckily for historians, we were colonized by the English. They kept meticulous records. and that helps us now retell. But it's in that mapping out, in that archiving of us, they are able to subjugate us, tax us. See how many cows we have, hut tax. All of these things get imposed onto us because they can map us. They can tell us then our own history back to us. That's how knowledgeable they are of us. And that is such an important point.
It is. Joanne, it will be a disservice if we don't let you read at least one excerpt from your book. I know you've been doing this 100 times, but these readers as well like to hear your voice, reading your voice and other voices in your novel. Please, just a short excerpt.
Just not one where we'll cry, because
yeah, I don't want to
not
cry.
The crying ones.
and then after that, Musa, or maybe let's go take you first. Yeah.
Because it's linked to what Joanne was.
I'm sorry, Musa.
Sure.
Yeah.
The question that you posed, or the comment you posed, and what Joanne was speaking about, I'm interested in finding out what inspired the form, historical novel,
Right.
And whether in reimagining history, it's important to take seriously interdisciplinary
Of course.
in teaching history.
Brilliant,
Not just
brilliant.
confine ourselves into one methodology, which is the archive of the novel.
That's
This is
fantastic.
important. And I want to find out to you what inspired the form of the historical.
Wow, that's beautiful, Musa.
That's a very complicated question, Musa. I've got to think about it before I answer it, because I didn't know much about the historical novel except for what I had been reading prior to that, kind of Fred Khumalo, some of the British authors like Hilary Mantel and Kate Moss and Kate Furnivall and so
Kate
forth.
Moss.
Yes,
Okay.
not the skinny models, Sandy.
But there's an E at the end of her name.
Yeah, exactly. But you look at all of these sources and you kind of say, okay, how can I pull them all together?
Yeah.
And so I suppose the novel is an amalgam of all that I read at that time, Musa.
Right.
And in a way, there's very little that's adventurous about it. The only thing that might be a little bit different is that it's got a frame tale set in 2 different times. And the reason I had to do that is because I wanted my protagonist, who is much older during the frame tale, to be able to go back and re-explore and have the benefit of hindsight, learn something from what happened to her, but also for her daughter, who has not lived through indenture, to be able to go and do that. Because I think we as a generation are also having to go back and re-examine what our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents went through in this country. We're exploring it in all sorts of ways, through land and so forth, but we're starting to relive those experiences, and we're starting to understand the intergenerational trauma. And we're starting to understand also when it's necessary to forgive our parents for things that they colluded in or didn't fully understand or didn't rebel against, for that matter, and when we ought to hold them accountable for the trauma that has traveled through into us, which is a difficult question, I think, that many of us are grappling with right now. But to come back to your question, I mean, I'm learning a lot from my daughter's history teacher at the moment.
Wow, that's really
Because I talked to her name is Marge Brown. She's ex-Black Sash, and so she's lived through some very interesting things. She's worked with women workers, a lot, and that experience it's so different, actually, to so many other sort of experiences of apartheid and so forth in the country. But she did an interesting thing. At my daughter's school, they did not start with post-colonial or colonial history.
Okay.
They started with pre-colonial history.
Wow, that's even better. Wow.
And just, it seems like such a simple tweak, right?
It does, yeah.
But actually, because the kids knew what was there before, they now understand what was taken away in different ways.
They understand the disruption, the
They
violence.
understand completely.
Yeah.
And there's a deep appreciation for what came before, and what devastated these continents afterwards. And so perhaps if I'm ever stupid enough to write another book, don't look too forward. I can see you sitting on the edge of your seat there. But perhaps I will start approaching it in different ways and start thinking about that. I mean, I'm watching this teacher teach the class a comparison of apartheid, the communism and the perception of it by the apartheid government during our period of apartheid, and Vietnam and America, and the way my daughter's thinking about history is very different to the kind of one-dimensional way I learned about it. So that for me is an exciting thing, and if I'm ever brave enough to write another book, I'll start looking at those different means of accessing history.
Before you go, let me ask one brave question. How does this book speak to the location of Indian South Africans in South Africa? Because that is a question that arises once you venture into this territory of going back to that theme. And it's a theme in South African literature that is not, in my view, as studied. If you're in Asia, if you're in Britain, there's a great deal of, But in South Africa, for instance, people say African literature, English literature, Afrikaans literature. But what is the location of the Indian South African in the broader canvas of South African literature? And what do you think your book, attempts to contribute, along those lines, if it is important at all to you?
It is important to me, and it was probably the main aim of writing this book, Brasandile, in the sense that you know, I'm not the first writer of Indian descent to write about indenture, right?
Sure.
There are many more before me. It's a small canon.
Small canon.
And, but it's really struggled to insert itself into mainstream South African literature. And that may be because of a multitude of things. But I think there is the perception that this can't really, or traditionally has not been considered African literature because it's a story of Indian people.
Right.
And that comes from the key question of where do Indians belong?
That's correct.
Right? In this democracy.
Yeah.
Are we foreigners?
Right.
Are we South Africans? Are we Africans? I mean, when did that transition occur? When we stopped being Indians and became Africans? You know, does our perception of India as a satellite overshadow our identity as South Africans or Africans? For me, that's not the case. I see myself as African for generations. My parents have, you know, as adherents to the black consciousness ideology, we've seen ourselves as black. But there are some Indian people who look to India as more than a satellite, who see it as the motherland, right? Which I don't fully understand. Sure. But perhaps there's a feeling of displacement, perhaps there's a feeling of dislocation that makes them think they don't know where they belong in the society. And certainly, in terms of literature, no effort, very little effort has been made to bring indentured literature into the mainstream. There is no sense of belonging. And so I thought to myself, well, if I have a bit of a profile, perhaps writing a book about something that is important to me, that I want to talk about, and that has largely been ignored, while still paying tribute to the writers, the forerunners who have been writing about it. Perhaps that's one thing I can achieve with this project, is just to say, well, okay, someone we know in the media has written this book. Perhaps it's worthwhile reading. Let me take a chance on this and read it. And I think it's been quite useful in that sense, because one thing I did not want this to be was an Indian story.
Yeah.
Right? I was raging against that.
Right.
It's an African story about how Indian people came here and how they became African, how the beginnings of that shift began. And the response I've received from, yes, Indian people are hit in a very visceral place with it, right? Naturally, particularly women. A lot of women write to me and say, wow, I knew it was brewing somewhere there in my history, but had never tapped into it. But black South Africans and white South Africans and colored South Africans have received the book with the same level of warmth, which I'm really grateful for. That they've actually opened their hearts to giving the story a chance.
Oh, no.
That's very gratifying.
Beautiful, beautiful.
I just wanted to add one thing, because Joanne's been incredibly modest about the fact that it's her personality, or people might know her. Actually, when I was reading it in my notes, I wanted to just say that this book might be a particular story about a person, or about an experience, or about an African story, or an indentured story. But ultimately, what makes it so talk to everyone is that the themes are universal, of exploitation, oppression, love, loss. All of those themes are here, and that's what speaks to people. It's not a parochial story that's only uniquely can speak to certain people. Yeah. It's like the best stories in the world that can be about anything. We could read a Gabriel Garcia novel, and that we'd feel everything from that novel. And that's what Joanne has managed to do, and that's why people are taking to it, Joanne, not just because they saw you on the news.
Yeah, she's writing across worlds. I mean, that is my observation as well. Yeah. It's a story for all of us. It belongs to all of us. I don't know whether you're in the mood of reading, dear Joanne.
I'm going to have to find it. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
While Farouk speaks, I will try and find a yes.
So firstly, thank you, Joanne. It's a brilliant. You made me cry.
Sorry, Farouk.
So thank you for that. Wow. And then, to give you some other feedback, I've come from similar stock as you do, though further north, and my thought came out as fascinating and economic. Right? So how do I get across this message of indentured labour and the whole indentured story to broader people who are not thinking about it?
Yeah.
And so I don't know whether you're going to like this or not, but I have got a lineage biology in the the Gauteng area of 770 people who are related to me. Wow. Right? Now, I've attempted a book about my brother familiars, and you've changed that for me. Somebody else changed it in 2010, and you've changed it. Because as much as I want to believe that I'm a feminist, I took the perspective of the male protagonist. I'm now, after reading your book, actually looking at the female in our family. Wow. Because she was the one who was really impacted, and in fact, all the people that came after my granny were women, strong women who kept the family together. I'm not saying the men didn't, but the women were the ones, and my mother was the prime example. Wow. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm putting you in a different category now. In the 1980s, I learned from Shabani's book on Eskia. Okay. And I learned from Eskia's feet. So my book that I've tried to write, I don't know when it will be done, I've taken the optic of a psychobiography, actually giving the perspective through me, my family, to what was happening around us. You've changed that for me, so I'm going to introduce a different element, and it may not be, it may move into fiction rather than non-fiction. So that's the one thing, and that's been a really important lesson. So thank you for that. But in terms of what we're doing, we have this, as our family of second cousins sort of thing. We have a WhatsApp group, and it's quite an active WhatsApp group, and it spreads across from Australia to India, Pakistan, England, America, and Canada. And what we've done is regularly, every fortnight now, we have an online, either they can listen in or watch us if they want, group conversation, and we read from your book.
Oh.
Ourselves, and at some point, when there's enough of a groundswell and questions, we're going to want to bring you in to answer some questions. So I am going to be knocking at your door, but truly, truly thank you for
such a lovely story. Oh, so wonderful.
To mention Eskem Pahlele, who talks about the burden of history, and you're on that theme, and Chabani Manganyi, beautiful historian, psychologist, psychiatrist, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Farouk, you threatened to cry, but you made me cry just about. Wow. You know, when you're sitting there slogging away at a novel, because in some ways it was a slog, right. and losing hope and thinking that, believing you will never get it right. You will never get it right. Over 9 years, you believe that very, very often along the way. To think that it will be of use to a family like yours, and it will be appreciated on that level, is a huge thing. It's so gratifying, and I'm very, very grateful to you for sharing that with me, and also sharing this with your family across the continents. You know, that it just reminds me of I've always grown up with this belief. I grew up in Chatsworth, which is a very vibrant community, but there's a part of living in Chatsworth that is grey. You know, and it's difficult to describe that unless you've grown up in one of the formerly apartheid, one of the formerly segregated townships, right? And I had a library near my house, but the school library, more especially, was where I went to meet the world, right? I used to. There was a little sunroom in the library I had, and. And I would go there in the afternoons, and I would take books out, and I would lie in the sun, and I would read every day, and that was a huge thing for me. Books liberated me, and they made me believe that I could do something a little bit more interesting with my life than a lot of other people around me had the opportunity to do.
I'm crying now, but I won't.
but isn't that? And when you talk about a story moving across geographies, that's what it means to me. The stories of other people touched me in the same way. And thank you for using this story to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, also, for just one point on your female protagonist. Haven't we just been programmed, right, to always look for the male protagonist in anything? And they've always got the lead role. And why, one reason, I've been thinking about it for a long time, but my instinct was that the protagonist should be female in this book. However, when that was confirmed was when I started on my PhD, and I was looking at the existing fictional literature. And there aren't a lot of female protagonists in indenture. There just aren't. There are families, there are men who are spoken about, but nobody really zooms in on the woman and says, what was your contribution? And I don't understand why. I mean, it has been done on other continents and in other formerly indentured territories.
Well, I mean,
earlier,
only recently, though. I mean, if you think
true,
about,
yes.
what's her name, Bahadur's?
Yes, Gayatri Bahadur,
Coolie Woman. I mean, that's the recent one that's actually been done in the Caribbean, and that's new. That's also new there. And if you think about Mauritius, even if you think about the work of like Marina Carter and Khaltura Buri, they are looking at indenture, but not particularly from women, as a site of oppression, as a site of people making new ways of living and showing their agency, but not so much about women. And I think it's new because often we take our lead from things that are happening in the global north. And even if you think of slavery, the narratives of slave women only start coming out in the 1980s, the 1990s. And whether it's in novels, whether it's in trying to recreate that history, the movies. I mean, if you think about Toni Morrison and them starting to write and becoming famous in the world, it's only then that actually Pranisha Badasi's work, which looks at women who have girl babies who have been killed by parents under indenture in South Africa, who studied with Molela and I. And she is very good on how that history is very recent. The recovery of that work is very recent because, it's been a global project of not including women in these narratives.
And it seems like such a logical thing to do when you think about it.
Yeah, very logical, but we don't do it.
We don't do it. And the question is, if you really want to know about a horrific event that happened in the world, why are you not looking at it through the eyes of the people who suffered most?
Yes.
Because those were the women.
It's the women.
And they were women and they were children, and many of those women were children. We refer to them as women, but my protagonist in this book is 14. And some children were taken into indenture even younger. So.
God. I've spoken to a friend of mine in the theater. I hope he reads your book and puts it on stage. For me, I also see a musical. Yes. I see an amazing musical from this work. We can imagine what you can do. Can you imagine if you're traveling for such a long 4 months? How many? You're traveling 3.5 months. How do you keep your emotions intact? How do you give each other a sense of camaraderie? I mean, I would imagine there's praying. I mean, of course, there's dancing, but I always hear music when I listen. I mean, when I read these stories, even if I'm reading, for me, music, just so natural, from the text that I read. So thank you very much. I would imagine we're about to call it a night, but dear Joanne, would you mind reading us?
She's trying to push it away.
Dear Joanne.
And it hasn't worked.
That's why I'm trying to behave as well. Because she's been reading so many times. But it's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brasandile. I think, you'll find out soon enough if you read the book that my character is in the Durban jail soon after the book begins. And you'll find out how she got there. But let me share some of the reflections on what life was like in the Durban jail. I have quickly grown used to the weight of chains. I'm no different, really, from the hardened men here who dig ditches with shackles round their ankles. Sometimes I try to glimpse faces beneath the arcs of their backs while I imagine what blood and gore brought them here. They work closely, their bodies almost touching, yet they are forbidden to speak. Words are dangerous. They're both gifts and weapons. In the colonial prison, there are divisions between British, Indian, and African inmates, male and female, young offenders, and adults, those who have been tried and found guilty, and those who have yet to stand in the dock. Prisoners accused of monetary crimes are kept apart from those who've spilt blood. In this wordless world, we eye each other as suspiciously as our jailers. I often glance over my shoulder to see another prisoner's eyes burrowing into me. I imagine them all to be murderers and rapists. Despair hangs like a fog here, but I do not let it swallow me. I give my jailers no trouble. I dig trenches, plow soil, and scrub prison floors unquestioningly. I am rarely beaten here. There are moments when news of a hanging frightens me, but I sponge my eyes and continue with my work. I seek courage as if she were a friend who would go to the gallows with me. I do not wish to die a coward. There is despondency in the eyes of women here, but I take no notice. I cannot carry their pain along with my own. I go meekly into confinement at sunset. I am deaf to my jailers shoving, their lewd remarks about how they would like to have their way with me. They must think me feeble-minded and docile because I never answer back. They are deaf to my silent curses. But as the lock clangs behind me and their footsteps grow faint, there is a part of me that unlatches from this body, cleaves through its broken skin, and hovers unfettered, leaping these jagged stone walls, gliding between past and present as I search for the answers that will lead me back to myself. I am a migrant, connected to my home by fragile threads that stretch across continents. They are too frayed now to hoist me back to the life I knew, to the girl I once was. Yet sometimes a longing for the place of my birth takes hold of me, and it pains me to be torn from all that was familiar to me, all whom I loved in India.
Thank you very much. You're so kind. I'm happy that you could indulge us. Wow. That was such a, very, very deep. You know what you also do? You enter those dark spaces with so much passion, in as much as it is painful, the way you do it, one just sees the vivid imagery that you paint in a charming way. But you're telling a horrendous story otherwise. For me, but you give it so much love, and you bring their agency beyond what the colonizer does, beyond and before, Let me just, maybe this is going to be my last, I would like to end with the words of Ben O'Cree. It has to do with the experience. Every day, every time, you take a book, there's something that happens to you, but I think if it's a good book, it doesn't happen once, it keeps on happening. Great art does that. Let me quote Ben O'Cree. Change is the territory of our relationship with art and the universe, because life itself is so fluid and the future is constantly defined and undefined. Defined and undefined. Ben O'Cree. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Vashna.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Vashna.